Hello everyone, I'm Jeanette Camping from Henry Stewart Events, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our latest webinar, Manage Your Content with DAM. Do you really need one? It's great to see 180 DAM professionals from 21 countries registered today. A couple of housekeeping points before we get started. We'll take questions at the end of the presentation, so please send them through and we'll take as many as possible in the time available. And this webinar is being recorded and you'll all be sent a link to the recording tomorrow. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Tim Pashuysen from Sitecore. Welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. Good morning for those on the west, and good evening, I guess, for those in the east. Happy to see a couple of familiar names in there. So today we're going to talk about DAM. And in the first place, I wanted to start with kind of reviewing what we all understand under the term of DAM and if we need it, what's it used for. Next up, we'll try to make the connection with what organizations are really struggling with today and to what extent a DAM can be useful or can be instrumental there. And then we'll have a look at making it a little bit more tangible, see what kind of use cases, what kind of stakeholders we can think of where we could help out with a DAM. So let's start with what is a DAM and why you might need one today. For those of you that have been around the DAM space for a while, the original scope of DAM, and I'm talking about, let's say, a couple of years ago now, was that of a central repository to manage final media files. So it was sort of a database for files that was at the center of a somewhat larger organization that couldn't get by managing those things off of a hard drive anymore. And the scope of the content that we were managing was final media files. Because it was a bit of a larger repository, we needed things like security. Access rights. Not everybody had the same rights to access the same scope of content. To keep things organized and to make things findable, we added metadata and taxonomies, essentially labeling our assets. And then finally, because we're dealing with media files, which can be a little larger and sometimes require proprietary desktop software, we facilitate renditions to generate previews that can be previewed in a browser, but also to allow people to download a low-res version or a bit of a different file type than the original. All in all, this relatively narrow scope is what used to be the official scope of DAM. Immediately, we would have to look at how that had an overlap or how that competed or how that was different with a couple of other software categories that were already on the market at that point. WCMS, content marketing platforms, cloud file sharing. So for example, a very common question would be, I have a WCMS and it has a media library. How is that different from a DAM? Well, then we usually would go into the fact that, for one, the library for WCMS only serves the WCMS as a target, but also that for a certain level of robustness, which you start to require at a certain scale or complexity, a media library doesn't cut it anymore. Typically, security, access rights, and metadata, and again, renditions are the three differentiators there between a media library and a proper DAM system. Content marketing platforms also usually have some level of media library, and much of the same arguments apply there as well. And then cloud file sharing, they probably can deal with the file sizes and they can deal with some of the security. But in a lot of cases, back in those days, that was a folder-based taxonomy. Things are somewhat catching up now, so that has become less of an argument. So I think the most important element there, as it stands today, is probably the ability to create renditions. A DAM was basically that central repository, and it was owned by, in the best case, a librarian that would usually sit in marketing and communications department. And the scope of people that would be working with the DAM would be said librarian, marketing communications department, and their partners, agencies, for example. That was traditionally the group of people that worried about DAM. When it came to the use cases, the original scope of DAM quickly got supplemented by a lot of things that border on DAM. And again, historically, those elements weren't within the scope of DAM, but nevertheless, people started to expect these things from a DAM platform. That was a very interesting thing because I guess it was because if you look at the different departments in a larger organization, by that time, everybody had kind of their dedicated platform. Finance and supply chain had an ERP, and sales had a CRM, and so on. And then marketing and communications, basically, when it came to managing data, the only enterprise platform that was specifically targeted at them was the DAM. So those stakeholders started to project a lot of their requirements, a lot of their desires onto the DAM platform, although the DAM platform, technically speaking, wasn't serving that. And that started to push the envelope of DAM in a good way, because a lot of these things are actually somewhat related to DAM, and it started to make a lot of sense as vendors started to take in more and more of these capabilities. Maybe a quick run through. Creative collaboration or work in progress. We just stated that a DAM technically only manages final media files. Well, what happens before that, the whole collaborative workflow with all of the versions and all of the visual annotations and online proofing, etc., obviously is heavily related to DAM. And there's a link. All of those draft versions are to some extent DAM assets that need to be managed in a certain phase of their life cycle as well. Building a little bit more on the process, all kinds of planning and project management tools. Project management tools like Basecamp and like Jira are really targeted at a different type of audiences, at different use cases. Although with some imagination, you could probably use them for the typical marketing processes. They're not always the most elegant fit. Artificial intelligence, it's become a little bit of a buzzword, but everybody is pushed to look into what artificial intelligence could do. DAM was in turn pushed by our customers to think what artificial intelligence or machine learning could contribute in the DAM space. And then on the right-hand side, web to print. When you have assets, but you don't have InDesign and you don't want to spend money or time on customizing stuff, why can't I do it through my browser? Rights management, in managing the intellectual property rights of the assets that you manage. It used to be different platforms that then in turn needed to be integrated. Content delivery, not just creating a rendition, but actually facilitating the delivery up into the channel, putting stuff on a CDN, etc. And then two important ones. As I said, marketing and communications were projecting all kinds of desires onto DAM. But DAM, technically speaking, was just managing media files. Well, marketing and communications had a master data management requirement too, and a little bit later on, when content marketing became the norm, a requirement to store content with a longer shelf life. And that actually triggered the telltale question that we used to see in RFPs. Can your DAM also store an asset without a file attached? Then we knew that people were looking for a platform to store their master data and their other content. So all of these needs started to be projected on DAM, and the scope of DAM was consequently made bigger and bigger. But that also means that the group of stakeholders that were working with them or being serviced by them became bigger and bigger. It wasn't just a marketing and communications platform anymore. It became a platform where a lot of people in the company, if not virtually every department, was a stakeholder, either as a contributor in the process or a contributor of the content or as a consumer of content. If we then zoom out a little more between all of those use cases and those requirements, there's also an aspect of integration. DAM back in the days used to be a silo. Integrations were not a given, and back in those days, they certainly didn't come out of the box. Now, in a larger organization, there's obviously several systems managing different pieces of information and different processes. And when you have a lot of things in the back office, like ERP and PLM and master data management systems and document management systems, and then the whole marketing production in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, all of those publication channels, it starts to make a lot of sense to break up out of those silos and get things integrated. So that was another big requirement that came on the table. Now, if we summarize, there's kind of 4 key questions that come up when it comes to what is a DAM and do I need it? The first one is, what are we managing? And over the last few years, that has shifted from managing just a very narrow scope of final media files to a much broader scope, holistically managing content, all kinds of content, usually with an undertone of content that is meant for some level of marketing, has become the norm. Second question is, what do we want to do with it? Traditional scope, again, was that of a library. Basically, after everything was final, and so the whole process of creative collaboration was behind us, people would go to the DAM and store final stuff in the DAM. That has shifted to an expectation that a DAM can manage the entire life cycle, from early days planning, ideation, over collaboration, over approvals and versioning, all the way to the publication of a document in channels. And then the third question, who do we target? It used to be just marketing and communications. Nowadays, it's all of the ecosystem. So marketing and communications in a lot of cases is still at the heart of it. But sales is just as much a consumer of things that are managed in a DAM. Same goes for support, etc. And then the fourth and final question, how does DAM fit into an enterprise landscape? Being a silo was okay a couple of years ago. Now, I think each and every customer that we talk to wants their DAM to be seamlessly integrated into their enterprise architecture. This was very DAM-centric, and for many of you that have been part of the DAM community for years, you know that we know that there's a lot of interesting stuff to do with the DAM, and it's a topic where a lot of people are can have very long and deep conversations about. At the same time, a DAM has never been top of mind with the CMOs, and in most organizations, the budget for DAM and the priorities for your DAM project are still set within the CMO organization, and DAM just wasn't on the radar. Front-end systems like WCMSs and analytics and social media management platforms comparably got a lot more attention because they were perhaps a little bit more tangible. It was not something that was sitting in the basement. It was not that same kind of foundational, but slightly boring and maybe a little bit too complicated type of platform. So let's zoom in on our decision makers there, and let's see what keeps our CMOs awake at night. These are a couple of numbers that we got from research, and they're actually relatively spectacular. If you know that most of our customers are working on a content marketing type of approach. So marketing is mostly built on having interesting and substantial content, and at the same time a omni-channel approach, which means that you try to address a growing number of channels with a consistent and a connected message between those channels, and at the same time trying to set up elevated conversations with customers. So trying to give customers content that is interesting to them, that is personalized to a certain extent. You'll get it that between those three, it kind of creates the perfect storm of content. Content is at the center of each of those things. Content is hugely important, but content is also becoming the bottleneck. And so when we talk to our customers on the marketing sides, this is the kind of picture that we see. 65% of marketeers spend most of amount of time on designing and creating content. That's a lot, right? That is not doing the actual field operations. That is not doing PR work. That is not doing events. Really crafting content. 60% create at least one piece of content each day. So it's part of their daily routine. 93% of B2B marketers use content marketing. It's the golden standard. 40% of budget is spent on content marketing, and 42% of companies have hired a designated content strategist. And yet, 5% have developed a completely systematic approach to producing content, which is virtually nobody. 14% felt they had the right technology in place, but again, almost half said they have tools, but they aren't using them to their potential. And then 69% said some systems in place, but still a lot of manual work. And 66% say better using technology to manage content as an asset was high up on the agenda. So this means that there is a certain awareness already that content is key, but there's also a lack of maturity, and people are getting a little anxious about it. They see this whole challenge of delivering quality content at scale, but there's very little plans or platforms or technology or process in place to do so. Now, let's see how that works out in the bigger picture. We'll get back to what the role of DAM can be in this challenge, but for now, let's keep the focus at the level of content. So if you talk to people, creating content in a lot of cases looks like this. A bunch of systems in the back office on the left-hand side, publication channels on the right-hand side, and then lots of drama, people running around screaming, trying to get work done to create content and feed all of those voracious channels. That is obviously not a good place to be if you want to scale and if you want to deliver with a controlled quality and cost at the same time. Now, let's double click. If we talk about channels, you'll often see that there's already with a lot of customers a relatively large amount of channels that are being served. But at the same time, those channels work, or the people that are serving those channels usually work in silos by themselves. There's the corporate.com team, there's the team that develops the apps, there's perhaps a social media team, etc., etc. And they're all creating their own content and they're all publishing their own content, which has a number of disadvantages. For one, double efforts, right? Everybody is reinventing the same content over and over again. At the same time, you're not using the synergies, also not in time in terms of speed. And then also in terms of quality, you risk to have a disconnected message between all of those channels, right? The consistency is not guaranteed there. So the first thing we can recommend there when it comes to content is take content ownership and content creation out of the channel and put it in front of the channel. And getting a little bit ahead of the role of DAM, this will probably start to sound familiar for some of you that have been active in the DAM space for a while, right? The first thing that we did when we broke out of the silo position as a DAM was to start looking at who we're going to serve with assets. Well, many of those same principles now apply for the broader scope of content. So moving content ownership out of the channel and in front, so that content sits in a shared library that serves all of these different channels rather than mini libraries that only serve their own channel. A second step is to include the whole life cycle of content, the whole process of content creation. And that's part of the spaghetti. In a lot of cases, that process is overwhelming. Sometimes because it's not very structured, sometimes because it is relatively complex with a large number of stakeholders when it comes to validation, etc. But in a lot of cases, people are actually tripping over their own feet by making stuff complex, by taking into account all kind of weird historical processes. So part of the exercise that we usually go through with our customers is to take out some of the drama. Most of these creative collaboration processes can be chopped into a fairly limited amount of milestones. In this case, for example, plan, collaborate, manage, and publish. And publish is where you push stuff to the channel. Manage is where you manage your final materials and perhaps the versioning and the life cycle as you update them. Collaborate is where you share files, do online proofing, online collaboration. And then planning is the start of it all, where you plan the creation of content or assets, but also some of the early ideation, delivering a structured briefing to creative agency, perhaps, etc. So a simple milestone-based process has the benefit that you don't have to draw out a complete detailed flowchart of your creative process, but you can still measure, because you can put those milestones on a dashboard and you can say, okay, we have this many work streams and they're all sitting there, or we spent this much time on your average planning collaboration phase, and you can see where things move along quite fluidly. You can see where things get stuck. This is really important to not go into too much detail when you initially try to nail down those processes, because in many cases those processes aren't very mature. They have a lot of variability between different cases or different groups, or perhaps different product families that you're serving or whatever. And so it can get quickly very complicated. So chopping stuff up in simple milestones and then leaving people organically collaborate is kind of the happy medium between defining a process and not over defining a process. Because if you over define a process, chances are that you haven't captured all of the complexity and that people will try to break out of it, and then you lose traceability, which is an even worse place than where you started. Next up, and this is something that is very dear to us, get connected with what's happening in the enterprise landscape. And we were already connected in the front. Now we're also connecting in the back. You have a bunch of platforms in your organization that you don't own as a marketing person, as a librarian for them, but that contain pieces of information that you need. You probably don't need everything that is sitting in an ERP or a PLM system, but imagine that product definitions are born in your ERP or your PLM, and some of your high-level specifications for products are also defined in the PLM. Say you're selling power tools for consumers. The voltage or the wattage on a power drill is probably managed in your PLM. Also, which SKU goes into which region? Like you're selling a different power plug in the UK than in mainland Europe. That has a code, that has a different picture. A lot of that is provided for free by a PLM or even an upstream PIM system. And if you can get that, you can be much smarter because it's part of the metadata and the life cycle that you get for free. If you have 100 pictures of that product and that product goes out of the assortment, if you can use the life cycle on the product to signal that it goes out of the assortment, you get to retire all of those pictures for free. Otherwise, you would have to manage all of that yourself in your DAM or in the middle. So being connected with the enterprise back office systems is very important for all of this, to set up sort of a supply chain of content, as we call it, through the organization. For bonus points, when it comes to a little bit more sophisticated content, it's a good idea to double click again on that and to try and define what modular content looks like. If you have, again, taking the example of a company that does products, if you have that power drill, chances are that you want to represent that on the website, you want to represent it on packaging, you want to represent it on documentation, and it's going to have some of the same elements that come back. A picture is an obvious case, but also commercial descriptions, bullets with benefits, etc. If you identify those as modular building blocks of content, you can start managing them at that level rather than managing all of the permutations of how you put them together. So that gives you efficiency, that gives you, again, consistency, better quality results, etc. And that is, again, another step towards a more structured approach. And then finally, we started with a diagram where everybody was sitting in their own channel. And we took content out, but by taking content out of the channel, obviously those people and those stakeholders also to some extent come out of the channel. They're now all stakeholders in this process. They collaborate on different pieces and different workflows in the middle. And it's no longer a given that content, for example, should be owned by who currently owns content. We should look at this a little bit more holistically as an organization and say somebody owns the platform and the process, and then there's people contributing content that can come from very different angles. There's people participating in the process of getting content to its final state, validating, etc. And then there's people who are users of content, that are consumers of content in the channel. So the first question was, what is a DAM? And we've discussed the historical scope and what is kind of the current scope, how people expect a DAM to look. Next up, we've discussed our primary customer, the person that will need to sign off on our projects, the CMO, what keeps them awake at night and what their challenges. And then we moved into a way of representing how all of this fits together. I think hidden in the sequence of those two storylines is our pitch that DAM has a strategic role to play in solving all of this. We call that the content crunch. And although DAM historically was just a component in solving this, I think DAM is at the forefront of pushing the envelope, expanding the scope, and claiming that position. And at Sitecore, we have called that expanded scope a Content Hub. So a Content Hub is really DAM expanded to all kinds of content types, with the inclusion of all of the processes that go around it and all of the collaboration. And then the whole connectivity with both back office and publication channel systems. That expanded envelope, that expanded scope is what we call a Content Hub. So let's try to make it just a little bit more tangible by looking at a couple of those individual stages that we defined in the whole content process. So first off, the planning stage. This is something that is still done a lot in Excel. If we look at current practice with our customers, what we really see is that in a traditional marketing approach, where you work mainly campaign-based, content production is always in the context of a campaign, and that sets the expectation that that content has a shelf life that is linked to the shelf life of the campaign almost. I think this is quickly evolving, and I think if you look at how content marketing could work better, is that you have two loosely coupled cycles. There is the cycle of campaigns, but there's also a cycle of creating content. And you should imagine that one group is continuously managing a body of content, massaging it, turning it into different directions, seeing where the holes are, seeing where something needs to be refreshed. That is one cycle. And then another cycle is that another group is continuously creating campaigns, big or small, and cherry picking content that is largely already available. Not to say that they couldn't make a request left and right, but generally speaking, the development of content is almost an independent process that gets feedback, but that isn't entirely driven by campaigns. And so this is an example of a typical screen that our customers use a lot in their daily practice. It's really a pivot table. For those of you who are fans of Excel, it's a pivot table where you choose your dimensions, you choose your columns and your rows, and as you change them, you get an insight in several dimensions of your body of content. And you can see if you have gaps, you can see if things are a little stale, you can see where you are if you set a certain scope in terms of when will this be finished. So that pivot view is very important, not just in evaluating what content you have, but also in starting to action on that. Like if there's a gap, you just hit the plus button and you create a briefing for a new piece of content. So it's a very interactive way, a very librarian way almost of continuously managing your content. One step further, the authoring of content. What's really important is that some type of content, like media files, are typically authored on desktop tools. There's still good reason for that. I don't think that a lot of real professionals are going to prefer a Photoshop in the browser over their trustworthy Mac. But when it comes to other types of content than heavy media files, a lot of the written content, there's actually no reason to do that offline. The one reason we noticed was that if you're a creative copywriter, people sometimes underestimate that you need to get in the zone as well. You need to be in a comfort zone where you feel creative, where you can get the creative juices flowing. And for a lot of people, that is still Microsoft Word. The kind of objections we got was like, yeah, but if I work in an online platform, it feels like I'm filling out a form, and that's no way to do creative copywriting. And they're exactly right. But the underlying reason of why these forms were there was that obviously getting content in through a Word file is nice, but you wanted to be a little bit more structured to go into that kind of higher state of modular content. You want to know what's the title, what's the intro. So you want to carve it up into kind of qualified fields, but then you're conflicting with that comfort zone for the creative copywriter. So we try to strike that very subtle balance in creating an environment that is enticing to creative professionals, and at the same time in the background capturing structured data. Also, we should realize that people are using nice tools in their private lives, right? People that need to collaborate with their friends, they're going on holiday and they want to make up a plan of things they want to visit. They'll create a Google Doc and they'll collaborate in real time. right? They'll do it on their phone, and another person will do it on their laptop, and they'll be chatting in the background, and all of those tools are available to people, and everybody knows what the golden standard is. Yet in the tools that we use in an enterprise context, sometimes we're using tools that are far from being so lovable as the tools we use in our private lives. So it's about time that we bring the golden standard of usability and likability to those enterprise tools as well. Collaboration, and again, you'll see many echoes of things that are familiar to people in the DAM space. Online proofing, all kinds of online collaboration tools. But again, we want to expand that beyond just media files. It's not just pictures and videos that we want to annotate. We also want to annotate text. We want to compare versions, etc. And we want to do all of that in an integrated fashion, without having to go to several tools, without having to open an email, download a Word file, open up the redlining section. It all needs to be online. It needs to be connected in one environment so that all of your information is connected as well. As part of that, certainly for people in regulated industries, having a full audit trail is very important. If you need formal validations from R&D or from legal, it's very important to have an audit trail on who said what and when you got a sign-off. Not just to deliver quality, but sometimes that process and that audit trail is a requirement from regulatory agents in and by itself. Then manage, and this will be even more familiar for people in the DAM space, properly managing a library of content with good taxonomy, good versioning, good security, has always been one of the things that set a DAM apart from things like a file sharing platform. So I think within the DAM community, we've developed quite a bit of practice around all of this. And I think if you expand that beyond just media files, it just makes a ton of sense. Again, let's take the example of a product company. How weird is it that you would have your written product descriptions live in a PIM system and then have your pictures live in a DAM system and then having to integrate the both? All of that content belongs together because essentially it's connected, and the connections between different pieces of content are what makes them useful, and that also brings the value of consistency, but also of efficiency. If you retire a product, you may as well use that to retire all of the assets that are linked to that product, and you may as well update your intellectual property rights management and make sure that you pull it off all of those channels where you distributed that content. So by connecting things that were previously separate silos in separate software categories, you're accelerating a lot of things in terms of efficiencies, but also in how much you can deliver on that challenge of delivering quality content at scale. Manage and curate, and again, I already talked about this, the practice of a proper library science approach to managing content is something where we can learn a lot from the DAM community. I think that is probably one of the most important elements that DAM can bring to the table when it comes to solving the repository question, that whole wealth of experience that we've built up there. And then finally, getting stuff out into a channel. Channels are usually just consumers of content, which means that you'll have to facilitate a lot. You have to present a channel with the proper rendition, so a certain file type, resampled and cropped to an appropriate size. Put on a CDN so that it is readily available for heavy hitting, but also that you can update that picture. If a product picture needs to be updated because the appearance of the product changed, or if you expired the rights on an image and you want to replace it with something else, owning the link on the CDN and being able to update that is really key. And then those channels need consistency, but by putting content in front of the channels, you almost get that for free. But they also have a desire to deliver the most elevated experience to the customers. And elevated could be that you want really good content. It could be that you want the richest possible content for that channel. So channels that will support video, you'll give them video rather than a picture, etc. But it also goes to the point of personalization. And personalization really is part of the mantra of putting the right content in front of the right person in the right context. If you gathered more information about a person or their phase in the kind of customer journey, you can play to that and you can serve them up the most appropriate content. That means that you'll need to have all of those different flavors of content, but that also means that you need to know what that content is about. And again, taxonomy and metadata and properly qualified content plays a very big role in being able to deliver some of that. And then to finish with this slide, we started off with the spaghetti. I think that DAM, if you take a lot of the learnings that we developed over the years from DAM, if you expand the scope by managing all contents, by including all of the life cycle and the workflows, and by being a very explicitly connected platform, both with the back office and the front channels, I think DAM has a really big role to play there in solving the content crunch and could become kind of the beating heart in a very dynamic but well-organized flow of information, rather than the spaghetti we showed at the beginning of this presentation. All right, I'm very open to questions. Please shoot.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have had some questions. The first one is, by final media files, do you mean the retouched photography, color-corrected footage that are ready to be used to produce an ad video, or does it mean the end product of the ad video?
Both, and those are actually the final deliverables of 2 cycles. So what if you analyze it, what will typically happen is that say you want to create a print ad, to keep it simple. The first thing you do is you'll organize a photo shoot, and the end deliverable of that process is going to be a finished, retouched, color-corrected picture. There's obviously a whole collaborative process. It starts with some brainstorming, people making sketches. It starts with a proper technical briefing for the photographer. Perhaps you get some quotes in. Then you do set production, and then you end up with raw files, and then you make a down select, and then for the down selected files, you want to do all of the retouching and the color correction, which is again a whole creative process in and by itself. At the end of that, you have final pictures, hopefully with all of the intellectual property rights on them. And then they go back into the process, and this time it's the layout process for that print ad. So a couple of those pictures get attached to the briefing, creative person and marketing person agree on which picture they eventually use, and then they put a layout on top, and it goes back and forth in different versions, and the final output of that process is the final print ad. And then you don't want to just store the PDF, you also want to store all of your composite files so that in 6 months or in a different market, you can repurpose that for maybe a localization and run it again through a whole process. So everything is very cyclic. And so the short answer is yes, all of the above.
Thanks, Tim. And then going back to slide 4, somebody asked, well, they've considered components like images, fonts, reusable text blocks being held in the DAM. What do you think?
Yeah, that's our whole evangelization on saying it should be more than media files. When you think about the print ad, when you think about a leaflet or a folder, that block of text is as valuable an asset. Somebody has made a briefing for it, somebody has copyrighted it, it's gone through review cycles. There's a lot of effort and quite frankly money in that snippet of text. So it deserves to be managed just like a valuable asset, just like we manage the media files. So that is the kind of the next step, expanding from just the scope of media files to all of those different components that are valuable assets as well.
Thank you. And then there was a follow-up to the first question. The cataloging taxonomy of these two different asset types are very different. One is meant to be raw, the other one is final. Any advice on how to properly structure the DAM?
Yeah, so what we usually do is we, although draft materials and raw files and retouched files and all of that live in the same platform, so technically speaking, they're all in the same platform. Through different taxonomies and through different security, we expose them in different ways. So the final materials, the way that you build the taxonomy for that is still pretty much the way that you would do it for a traditional DAM. When it comes to work in progress, we separate that out by giving it a different lifecycle label, which is also a part of the taxonomy. And also for security, typically final materials, you regulate security based on markets or departments or roles within that department that get access to certain slices of the content. While for work in progress, it's typically an invitation only. It's more like we add a couple of people to a workspace and they'll see the work in progress until it gets through the final validation.
Thank you. And the next question is, what do you consider a best practice for distributing metadata in a system leveraging both a DAM and CMS-based content model?
So I think there's a couple of things in there. I think with a traditional DAM scope, it has always been a concern that once the asset leaves the system, the metadata that is attached to it would be gone. And then we've been trying to solve that by embedding the metadata in the EXIF fields, for example, which has the benefit that it always travels with the file, but it also has the disadvantage that really sophisticated structured metadata is kind of hard to squeeze in there. And then people have been using Sitecore files, etc. And I think attaching intellectual property rights to a media file is one of the most pressing examples. Obviously, when you have connected systems, you have the big benefit that once you allow something to flow to a channel, if it's a connected system, you can make sure that as part of that process, which is not a manual thing, it's a system-to-system integration. You can have part of the metadata that is relevant travel to that platform. Also, the other way around, when you start to do personalization in your platform, you have to rely on metadata. Say that I'm personalizing a certain web page and I'm personalizing the visual that sits on top. And I have three types of personas that I work against. I have my marketing person, I have an IT person, and I have a finance person that I want to address. And I want different pictures. Well, then I have to go back to my DAM and I have to find that information in the qualification that I put on top of those pictures. That's metadata. So building that connection in metadata is kind of very much linked to the fact that you do an integrated platform. And then expanding on this, the exact same thing goes for a snippet of text, for example. The exact same thing goes for variations in representing the benefits of a product, etc.
Thank you. And the next one is, this seems great, but do organizations do all of this at once, or where do you start?
Yeah, so Rome wasn't built in a day. I think in a lot of cases, we talk to people and they're a little bit overwhelmed as it is. Think about the spaghetti. So it's the process isn't clear, the path forward isn't clear. So the first thing to do there is lay out the broad strokes of a path forward. And I have to acknowledge that is a very ambitious path forward. It has a lot of functionality to turn on. It has a lot of practical concerns. It has a lot of change management from an organizational point of view embedded in it. So the next thing is to kind of draw a roadmap. How do I get to that ideal state and that kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? And then we usually make a plan where you chop it up into getting to value fairly quickly, some low-hanging fruit, some little bit of foundational work, but also some rewards so that you build a fan base within your organization, and then subsequent steps as you go. And so it's not so much a technology challenge. The technology is available, and it quite frankly requires very little customization. It's mainly configuration, but customers have to pace it in terms of what their organization can digest at once.
Thank you. And I think this is the last question, Tim. How much involvement of my IT organization is still required or advisable in this?
So we've seen the role of IT in these kind of projects dramatically change. Not necessarily be reduced, but change. Number of years ago, typical DAM implementation would be a very nasty, heavy customization track, and IT would be very much involved in all of that. Nowadays, most of our customers are asking for a SaaS platform. As it comes to Content Hub, that's the only thing we offer. So the whole infrastructure piece goes away. That is no longer a concern. So IT there has a new role. They have a role of vetting the vendor. They have a role of doing security review. They have a role of checking whether we can be appropriately integrated in an enterprise landscape. And then I've seen, certainly in larger organizations, IT kind of refocusing their service in the organization to maybe facilitate a shared first level support help desk that then next talks to our help desk when they have to escalate a question, or build an internal project management organization of people that have combined project management and technical skills to guide their business departments through the implementation of such a platform. So I think IT is still very important, but between a SaaS platform and a platform that requires business logic configuration rather than customization, it's a fairly high added value role that we see for IT.
Tim, there is one more question. Can you share recommended taxonomy templates for different industries? The challenge is where to start.
Well, what we do bake into our, let's say, our out-of-the-box install, if you would just take a plain vanilla Content Hub, most of the things that are typical for managing media files, managing other content types are already in there. Like, it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel and have customers figure out that a PDF is probably a document or a layout, and that this or this flavor of raw file is a raw file. So all of that comes out of the box. The tricky part is when it is customer specific or industry specific. Customer specific obviously will have to talk to the customer, and we facilitate a lot of that conversation, and there's great consultancies out there that do the same. Like you've got John and Teresa on the slides I see. There's Stephanie with Dovecot, all really good people to help you out with that customer specific part. And then for the industry specific stuff, there are initiatives, like if you're in retail or consumer goods, there's the GS1 initiative. There's also the schema.org initiative, which is a little bit more general. So there are some industry specific initiatives. I think it's fair to say that adoption and relevancy varies. I think retail has done a lot of work If I look at automotive, probably not that much standardization. Pharmaceuticals, not that much either. So it really depends on the industry that you're in.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. We'll draw the webinar to a close now, as that was the last question. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for listening today, and we hope to see you at our future webinars and online courses. Any last words, Tim?
Last words for the webinar, that is, right?
Yes.
So, thank you all for attending. And as this is important these days, stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Cheers.